Thank you, and apologies for not having prepared the PowerPoint presentation for today. Actually, I think the introductions have followed very well, because what I would like to do today is really focus on what we have done since October. I think many of you have heard over and over again where we're coming from, so what the context leading up to the communication was, and where and how we decided to proceed. Just to touch upon very briefly was that the Green Paper consultation and the thematic workshops that we held with industry did provide us with a lot of information and a lot of evidence and good practices for us to identify what the challenges are and what the key priority areas are. So that is where we came from in deciding to focus on 5 key action areas. And of course the challenge was in what types of initiatives could we come forward with, keeping in mind that we have, yes, a quasi-unanimous call at EU level for the Commission to come forward with action, but there were quite differing views, I would say, as to what type of action the Commission was called to come forward with, and there was even a broad majority of outright rejection for sector-specific legislation, but that was a challenge for the Commission. So one thing that we immediately did as soon as we adopted the communication is to get back in contact with those member states who were subject to infringements, but also, in the meantime, we also had several complaints. And of course, as probably a number of you are aware, the Commission has specific instruments and procedures as to how these things proceed. So yes, we know that the figure is 20 member states are subject to infringement proceedings and or to complaints. But where they are only subject to complaints, the process is very different. So there the Commission enters into dialogue with the member states and this so-called instrument, which is the EU pilot. And I'm saying this just in terms of the process from having contacted the member states, because I know that there is expectation of the Commission to come forward with action ASAP. But we have to gather the information from the member states, the legal information, the factual evidence, and we have to assess all this also in terms of development of case. So that's to give a broader picture. But yes, we've embarked on that, and yes, since October we have received responses from several member states. We've entered into dialogue with member states, and sometimes even where needed with the complainants if we did feel that we needed further information and evidence from their end. And now we're at this stage where we will start assessing all the responses that we got. And some of you may be aware that the responses can range from 2 pages to 400 pages, so it's quite a lot of work, which is on our desks. Another thing which we did embark on as soon as we adopted the communication was to set up the expert group of regulators. And since October, we've had 2 meetings with regulators. And the Commission has purposely invited member states to nominate 2 experts from their gambling regulatory authorities. Usually the procedure is to nominate 1, but the Commission recognizes that in the member states the competence of gambling regulators may be shared between different authorities, or in some member states you might have more than 1 regulator responsible for gambling. I'm thinking of Germany, of Spain, or of the UK in this instance. But of course it is up to the member states to nominate their representatives. And we've had 2 meetings with those member states. So that is sort of the framework within which we intend to work. The Commission has also been very vocal in saying that we want to draw from what exists out there. So what exists in terms of good practices in the member state, but also what industry has done. And we would like to repeat the exercise we did during the Green Paper consultation, and we will organize thematic workshops with industry. And the first one will be held in April, so industry has already been invited. Going on to a second main area that we identified for action, it is administrative cooperation. And there the Commission aims to facilitate administrative cooperation. Again, I think as Mr. Fox has hinted, we should not underestimate the importance and the relevance of having member states sit together around the table. You have different level of expertise between the regulators, and you have different departing points of member states. And the Commission intends to keep all member states around the table to build mutual trust. So what we aim to do is to explore those areas where member states can and want to cooperate amongst themselves. Again, we have to keep in mind the different structures of member states and the different competencies of member states. If you think of, for example, advertising, if you have, if I may cite the UK again, the UK Gambling Commission may not necessarily be directly responsible for the advertising itself. It has a specific body responsible for that. So we have to be very cognizant of the ambit within which we are working. And the objectives, the further objectives of administrative cooperation that we aim to work on is also to see what exists, where member states can cooperate on at the operational level, so at the practical level, how they can share experience about the supervisory roles that they have, and the extent to which they could request and exchange information. And of course, for that you have to have a kind of a template, if you like. So we have to identify the best way to facilitate this type of cooperation, because we are trying to move a bit more forward than the existing bilateral agreements or existing exchange of emails. We want something structured and something which member states can turn back and refer to where need be. And of course, another important underlying objective of facilitating administrative cooperation is to reduce, where possible, the administrative burdens which are not necessary to have in place. And that is one important aspect that we're discussing with member states, and we've had 2 full debates so far. Another priority area that we're working on, and it is a priority for 2013, is the adoption of 2 recommendations on the common protection of consumers of online gambling services and on responsible advertising. It is a Commission recommendation as such, but because the Commission intends to keep everybody around the table and to draw from what exists out there, the Commission is discussing the recommendations with the member states, and with the workshop that I just mentioned, we intend also to touch base with the experts from industry, because ultimately, even though the member states can adopt the recommendation, of course, industry has to implement it as well. They have also their responsibility over there. I don't know if all of you are aware, but we did publish a roadmap which gives the full details of the objectives of where we're coming from and where we would like to go with the recommendations. And as we said that we would like to have evidence-based policy, even though it's a recommendation, we will be drawing up an impact assessment. So that is why we do need to have all the evidence to factor into our 2 objectives. In terms of what the aim of the 2 recommendations are, of course, yes, it is to protect all citizens. So yes, it is to have clear mechanisms in place to, for example, prevent minors from accessing online gambling content or from having accessibility to website and to advertising of gambling, etc. But it's also to protect the player when playing online, in terms of protection from developing a problem while gambling, but also to protect the player from so-called third sources, if you like, so from fraud of, the consumer rights, if we can call them that, the deposits, their withdrawal of their winnings, and their right to have complaints, right of redress, etc. So even though it's a recommendation, we would like to touch upon all of these, because these did come out of the responses that we got through the consultation. In terms of what else we're doing on consumer protection, because we would like to also have more factual information of what we mean when we talk about a gambling disorder, about a problem gambler, about excessive gambling, about compulsive gambling. Many of us might use them interchangeably, and we feel that we do need at least a common understanding and common terminology. And the Commission has this ongoing project called ALICE-RAP, which is funded under the 7th Framework Program. It is looking at addiction of lifestyles in Europe in general, but gambling is one of them, and there we're trying to have the researchers focus on online gambling, so hopefully we do get more out of that. Another interesting, I would say, initiative is to get the consumers' feedback. The Commission publishes the Consumer Market Scoreboard every year, and gambling has been one of the markets surveyed, and what we aim to do from this year is to see if when you split between the online market and the offline market, whether the perception of the feedback of consumer changes. So we should get that feedback this year as well. It's another new initiative. And also what we are doing is we're having a kind of a behavioral study, which we will hope will help us test the recommendation against the measures that exist out there. So it will take the form of a part of a laboratory study. So we take measures that we talk about identification procedures, reality checks, self-control mechanism, limits, etc. We aim to test these against consumers. If I move on quickly to the fourth aspect that we're working on, the third aspect that we're working on, it is about money laundering and fraud. And there the main initiative is the review of the Anti-Money Laundering Directive. It is the only legislative proposal in the communication. And why did we come up with this proposal? It is because feedback again was quasi unanimous in calling on the Commission to extend the Money Laundering Directive to all types of gambling services, not just to casinos. Because there was a reference to casinos, perhaps it wasn't clearly defined in the existing law, and it was implemented differently in member states. So there the Commission has come up with a proposal to extend this. We've come up with a definition as to what we mean when we talk about gambling in terms of the Money Laundering Directive. But of course now that takes its own course as it goes to Parliament and to Council for negotiations. And we do aim in 2014 to explore a standard on gambling equipment. We purposely use the word explore because we're quite realistic on already being ambitious within these 2 years of what we want to do. We've identified the 2 recommendations concerning consumers as a priority for 2013 because we've been called a lot upon to do something to protect consumers, but we equally recognize of the importance of trying to do something also when it comes to the standards. So there we do aim to commence this year, but it is at its early stages. I admit that we have not yet really progressed much further than that. When it comes to sport, there's a lot which is ongoing. We do aim to come to a recommendation on best practices, and again here we do intend to carry out an impact assessment, and we've also published a roadmap which gives all the information as to where we're coming from and why. But the underlying objective is to streamline all the efforts that already exist out there and to have a bit of concerted action at EU level. And again, we are intending to carry out studies to help us feed into the impact assessment and to draw from what already exists there, whether in legislation or whether self-regulatory approaches of industry and or of the sport bodies. There is also simultaneously, as you know, an initiative by the Council of Europe, because they would like to have an international convention to combat the manipulation of sport results. And there, at the moment, the Commission is in discussion with member states in Council, because we need a mandate to be able to negotiate. We can participate as observers, as the Commission, but if we don't have the mandate, then we cannot negotiate. But it's not just about getting the mandate, it's also, of course, about the content of the mandate. So those are the main areas. I mean, we also publish with the communication a staff working document. We're also limited by number of characters, so we had to keep our communication within the limits. But the staff working document gives more information of what we intend to do, plus other accompanying initiatives, which are not less important than the ones I have mentioned. As I said, we intend to continue discussing with member states in the expert group, and the next expert group is in April, and simultaneously the first workshop we intend to hold with industry is in April. We've sent out the invites to have a structured debate, and because we want to have a really in-depth practical debate, we intend to keep it in a small group, so we're talking 15, 20 people. So in the first workshop, we have purposely decided to discuss only directly with the gambling operators, and we will focus on the recommendations on consumer protection and on advertising. But in other workshops that we have scheduled for the rest of this year, we will work with the intermediary services, whether on these recommendations, but also directly whether it's on the sport recommendation with sport bodies and with all related stakeholders. So we do intend to remain transparent in all the work that we are doing. I also am very cognizant that that there are those who want the Commission to go further, those that feel that the Commission is going perhaps too slow. We feel that with the initiatives that we've identified, we are working in a step-by-step approach, and we feel that we have found a balance to work both with member states and with all interested stakeholders. So I hope that this gives a bit of an idea of where we're going. I have left out the international dimension in the debate, but those of you who have read the communication know that if we're talking about administrative cooperation or about sports, there we do intend to focus also eventually on the international dimension. So I think I can leave it at that. Thank you very much.